I'm Eve Houghton, and I'm the curator of Pastime with Good Company, Writing and Leisure in Early Modern England, an exhibit about 16th and 17th century manuscripts at Yale's Beinecke Library. Obviously, we've had to close the library, and I'm recording this from home, so thank you to everyone for watching this video and other videos that we've created so that people can see the exhibit virtually. The exhibit asks how literary manuscripts show us what early modern people did for fun. But it also takes as a central theme the impact of disease on forms of literary production, recreation, and sociability in the early modern period. As I was thinking about how to give these remarks, that aspect of the exhibit now seemed uncomfortably prescient and made me think that I should rewrite the talk to focus more on those questions. It's easy for us to think about the plague as a relic of a supposedly quaint and superstitious era, like England in the 1600s. But perhaps the events of the past weeks make it interesting or important to consider how early modern people lived under what sometimes must have seemed like the omnipresent threat of disease. There's also the more local and specific question of how universities dealt with the threat of plague in the past. You may have seen the meme going around about how Isaac Newton did his greatest work after he was sent home from the University of Cambridge in the 1660s, when it closed because of the plague. What has been less discussed is that this was not the first time that Cambridge had to shut down its operations due to the threat of disease. This actually happened several times throughout the 1600s, including a very serious outbreak of the plague in 1625, when John Milton, author of Paradise Lost, was an undergraduate at Christ College, Cambridge. The university canceled lectures, public gatherings, and festivals, and sent students home. That was the most severe outbreak, but the plague actually came back in a few waves after that, and it's safe to say that the mood at Cambridge was pretty grim in the late 1620s and early 1630s. You may be wondering what all this has to do with writing and leisure in early modern England, since there doesn't seem to have been much to laugh about. But while you might expect that the creative and social life of the university would have diminished in this period, the archival and manuscript record suggests otherwise. Of course, there's a serious qualifier here, which is that such literary production was limited to those who had the time, means, and leisure to write, which then, as now, was a class-bound category. Nor were people necessarily creating great literary works. In fact, much of the literary material they were producing was highly ephemeral, topical, and often just plain bad. I really appreciated the recent corrective from Geoffrey Miller, a scholar of Milton at Montclair State, who pointed out on Twitter that Milton did not, in fact, write Paradise Lost during his plague-ridden undergraduate career. Rather, I think maybe the closest modern analog for explaining what Milton and his fellow undergraduates were doing in this period is that it was more like making memes than making literature. To give one example, around the same time that the University of Cambridge was coping with and recovering from serious bouts of disease, there was a massive vogue for writing poems about Thomas Hobson, who was the carrier or mailman for the university. Everyone knew Hobson because he was one of the main conduits from the university to the outside world. So he delivered letters and packages to London, and he rented a rotating stable of horses to Cambridge students and tutors. And actually, if you've heard of Hobson's choice, which is the rule that you have to choose the next horse in the queue rather than chaotically choose any horse, that's the rule that is named after Hobson and is still followed by taxi drivers today. Hobson died early in 1631, apparently not actually of the plague, but of natural causes, since he was in his 80s, quite old for the 17th century. After he died, there was an outpouring of epitaphs, jokes, songs, anecdotes, and satirical poems, many of which were copied down in manuscripts that survive today in collections like the Beinecke Library. The fact that these were handwritten copies and not printed books meant that the poems had a more restricted, primarily university-centric audience. For a while, it seemed, everyone at Cambridge was writing and copying poems about Hobson, including the undergraduate Milton. 5 manuscripts in the Beinecke's Osborne collection of English literary manuscripts contain poems memorializing the university carrier, and I have 2 of them on display in my exhibit. These poems circulated because people kept writing their own takes on the Hobson trope, and then sending them to a friend or copying them down into manuscript compilations of poems. The scholar of English literary manuscripts, Mary Hobbs, was one of the first people to argue that there is a connection between the Hobson phenomenon and the recurrent outbreaks of plague at Cambridge in this period. She suggests that there is a reciprocal relationship between confinement and sociability. Students were looking for distraction and recreation, and while they stayed indoors, they started experimenting with this fad for poems honoring the late and much lamented university carrier and sharing their efforts with people in their social circle. Put another way, Hobson became what we might call an early modern meme. In some ways, this is an optimistic view of forms of literary sociability, suggesting that literature was able to bring communities together, perhaps even when people couldn't physically gather. But what really fascinates me about the Hobson poems is their fundamental ambivalence of tone. Were people genuinely grief-stricken about the loss of Hobson, either personally or as a figure for the collective grief of the university community after 1625? Or was this basically a joke, and not a particularly nice one at that, predicated as it was on class difference and contempt for those lacking the status of gentility bestowed upon those who had university degrees? In other words, do these poems really do more to bring together the students by making others the butt of the joke, reinforcing the divisions between an us and them? The Hobson poems often took the form of short, easy to recite or copy down epitaphs, like this one, which is from one of the Beinecke's Osborne manuscripts. Here lies Hobson among his many betters, a man unlearned, yet a man of letters. These two lines say a lot about the social order in England around the year 1630. As social historians of the period have shown us, the question of who had the right to call himself a gentleman was becoming increasingly hard to arbitrate. The universities of Oxford and Cambridge were a major site for anxiety about social mobility because they were increasingly accepting more people from different kinds of backgrounds, everyone from the sons of the aristocracy to the sons of yeoman farmers. Indeed, merely entering your name in the matriculation register of one of the colleges entitled you to call yourself gentleman or esquire. So on the one hand, attending Oxford or Cambridge was a way to fast-track yourself to gentility. On the other hand, the universities were therefore full of people, sometimes uncertain about their place in the social order, and who were thus eager to emphasize the class distinctions that distinguished them from other people who lived around the university. This might go some way towards explaining the characterization of Hobson as a man unlearned, yet a man of letters in this poem. The joke is that Hobson merely carries letters rather than reading them. But the suggestion that Hobson at Cambridge was among his social betters in some ways strains the truth, since Hobson was a respected citizen and successful businessman who amassed a considerable fortune. Although other Hobson-themed poems are not so overtly class-prejudiced, they often contain heavy-handed classical allusions or satirical depictions of Hobson that seem to function to foreground the educational distinction between the writer of the epitaph and its object. The emphasis on Hobson's supposedly unlettered background thus attempts to reinforce the increasingly porous distinction between the minor gentry and newly wealthy tradesmen in towns and cities. That this was a time when disease was very much alive in the collective memory no doubt contributed to a sense of heightened anxiety about contact with people from different social, regional, or class backgrounds. But ironically, plague conditions and fear of physical contact with others only made Hobson more central to the intellectual functioning of the community. The postman was in fact possibly the most important person in the university in 1625, since, unlettered or not, he was the man of letters who maintained the crucial links of communication relied upon by manuscript circulation networks. I've hoped to show today that anxiety about contagion was not just a feature of early modern literary culture in times of plague, but was actually central to the way that people thought about manuscript circulation itself, as a powerful medium for reaching wider audiences, but also as a way of exerting control over that dissemination by limiting who had access to a certain letter or manuscript. But manuscript circulation was in reality open to a variety of forms of unwanted contact. After all, letters could be opened or intercepted. Indeed, before the advent of modern germ theory, the sending and receipt of manuscripts was even suspected as a possible vector of disease, as when the Cambridge authorities tried to shut down Hobson's postal service. John Milton's Hobson poem depicts the university carrier as physically unharmed by the plague, but devastated by the collapse of his occupation as people increasingly feared to send letters. Ease was his chief disease, and to judge right, he died for heaviness that his cart went light. His leisure told him that his time was come, and lack of load made his life burdensome. In this sense, disease control methods tended to foreground and literalize early modern people's sense that there was a need for manuscript to limit its own circulation and distinguish between insiders and outsiders. For example, my exhibit also deals with the tradition of manuscript drama in the 17th century, which is to say the writing of plays for a limited coterie or closet audience. One of the amateur manuscript plays on display in the exhibit, The Merry Wives of Cambridge, speaks to similar town-gown themes as the Hobson poems, and that it deals extensively with the erotic and economic relationships between the students and the people who lived around the university. The play follows two libertine students, Smart and Ogle, who are comically averse to any form of academic work. In this sense, their conspicuous consumption or conspicuous leisure, as the economist Thorstein Veblen would term it, is a form of class marker. And this is a passage from the Beinecke manuscript. In the morning, they tumble out of bed at 8 and sip their tea till 11. Then they dress and go to dinner. In the afternoon to the bowling green and to chapel at 5. That is, if the game be up when the bell rings. At 6 to supper, at 7 to the tavern, and to bed when they can sit up no longer. The emphasis on the students' supposedly endless leisure is intended to distinguish them from other characters in the play, like their tailor, Mr. Crabbe. On the other hand, the tradesmen and the students are depicted as profoundly and troublingly interdependent. Mr. Crabbe puts up with Smart and Ogle because he is economically reliant on them. Who is it that maintains you? His wife asks, even as the students conveniently forget to pay their debts, spread the dangerous political ideology of Jacobitism throughout the town of Cambridge, and attempt to seduce Mr. Crabbe's daughter. Indeed, the threat of sexual contact and transmission runs throughout the play, and in this sense, it is part of a long tradition of university coterie writing about the role of women in the community. Gender was, of course, one of the main categories of distinction for people who lived in these all-male educational environments. But of course, it isn't really true that these environments were all male and that there were always women present in the early modern university. They were the wives and daughters of college officials, they lived in the surrounding towns and villages, and they worked as college servants. In this sense, the preoccupation with women as other that is evident in these manuscript poems is perhaps less a reflection of the wholesale absence of women from the life of the university, and more of a reflection of the need to conspicuously exclude women from the joke in order to facilitate social bonding between men. There are many widely circulated university poems about women in the 1630s. One was a notoriously misogynistic series of verses about a figure called Mrs. Mallet, a supposedly unattractive woman who sexually propositions the speaker. The original Mrs. Mallet poem by Richard Corbett, master of Christ Church College, Oxford, begins by asking what he has done to deserve this fate, and goes on to compare sex with Mrs. Mallet to various torments, including the torture of conspirators implicated in the gunpowder plot. And this is a few lines from the poem in the Beinecke manuscript. I guilty am, proceed, I am content. Let Mallet take me for my punishment. For never sin was of so high a rate, but one night's hell with her might expatiate. Although the law with Garnet and the rest dealt far more mildly, hanging's but a jest to this immortal torture. The Mrs. Mallet poem was enormously popular. There are dozens of copies found in manuscripts today, including at the Beinecke, as I show in my exhibit. Like the Hobson poems, it also spawned a litany of variations and imitations as people started writing their own versions of the Mrs. Mallet poem, perhaps hoping to show off their wit by putting their own spin on a familiar trope. My exhibit refers to certain manuscript poems like the Hobson verses or Mrs. Mallet verses as viral, to use a deliberately anachronistic term. I say this not only in the sense that some were written in times of disease, but because they spread through copying and recopying, achieving a reach far beyond their immediate social context. For instance, someone might send a poem to a friend who would then copy it and pass it on to someone else. Poems could also metaphorically metastasize as individuals changed lines or added verses of their own. This is why we can look at the Beinecke's manuscript collections and see dozens of different versions of the same poem in many different manuscripts. When I was writing the exhibit labels, I meant to use the ideas of memes or virality to try to find contemporary analogs for explaining this concept of manuscript circulation. But in our current moment, I think the negative connotations of virality are very much on everyone's mind. The modern concept of virality has perhaps always been double-edged, and that it implies social currency or ability to reach a wide audience, but also the idea of something possibly harmful or disreputable that can spread like an infection, beyond human agency or control. That's why I think it's not an accident that many of these university poems that I'm calling viral tend to reflect both a desire to perpetuate themselves, but also an anxiety about reaching the right kind of audiences. Hence why so much manuscript poetry tends to have features seemingly designed to impede understanding or being in on the joke for all but a few. Features like blanks, anagrams, inscrutable banter, and references to highly specific events and people. Some have likened early modern manuscript culture to a social media for the 17th century. And in this sense, it constellates some of the same questions we ask about the internet today. But the question of whether early modern social media brought people together or kept them apart, especially in times of disease, is maybe the wrong question, and that it seems to me that it was almost always doing both. Manuscript poetry reflected a desire to connect with others and consolidate group bonds, but also a desire to scrutinize and reinforce the borders of that community. Indeed, what made these poems funny to certain contemporary readers, and thus viral in the sense that they were frequently copied, imitated, and passed around, is not always separable from the fact that they were often jokes at other people's expense. The discussion of early modern leisure and the phenomenon of viral amusements is then not only or merely a study of what people found funny and worthy of circulation. It also reveals the boundaries that the literate and leisured class drew around itself. Who wrote and who didn't, who was included and who was excluded, who was given credit for wit, and who became the object of jokes. Thank you.